Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes Benz? My friends all drive Porsches, I must make amends. Worked hard all my
Online
lifetime.
lecture series, lecture number 15, Bringing the War Home, Vietnam and the Counterculture. The 1960s were a period of radical change, revolution, and chaos in American cultural history. This decade saw dramatic changes in our law as civil rights advocates won tremendous deserved battles in 1964, 65, and 68. The Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, had ejected itself into the very fabric of our society, more so than any other court before, causing tremendous controversy and change by banning prayer in public school, desegregating public facilities, protecting the rights of people accused of a crime, and ultimately by delivering the highly unsatisfying lone gunman verdict in its investigation of John F. Kennedy's assassination. As the Second Red Scare seemed to be subsiding, America became deeply engulfed in another war in Asia against communist proliferation. The rock and roll of 1960 was for teeny bopper, bubblegum-chewing, clean-cut kids who were infatuated with teen idols and pinups. By 1970, the Beatles had revolutionized the way rock and roll would be understood. Even the mode of broadcasting music had changed. Despite AM radio's stronger signal and broadcasting radius, the FM stations that began surfacing in the late 1960s featured a much clearer signal that could also broadcast in stereo. As a result, rock and roll became much more sonically complex, its songs became longer, and its messages and meanings more introspective and thought-provoking. The hope that 1960 offered in a youthful, engaging president, a man whose initial message of aggression and separation had been religiously transformed into a message of interracial hope, a seemingly angelic leader who sought to join peoples despite their differences, and the younger brother who injected so much hope back into 1968 America's presidential election, were all murdered in their prime. By 1968, President Johnson's Great Society failed, and in its wake, turmoil, pain, and confusion remained. All focus was upon a war that had become increasingly unpopular as Americans gradually lost the vision behind why they were fighting it. Vietnam divides our nation. As late as 1964, Vietnam barely registered in the public consciousness. By the end of what would have been Kennedy's first full term in office, the U.S. had been largely supplying our South Vietnamese allies with weapons, vehicles, and cash it needed to continue to wage war against the communist Viet Cong revolutionaries. We committed comparatively very few troops to the fight, most of which were in purely advisory positions. The Gulf of Tonkin, of course, changed all that, as President Johnson asked Congress for and was granted the power to take all necessary measures to fight the communists. As a result, beginning in the fall of 1964, Johnson began committing a rapidly increasing American force to Vietnam with the express mission of fighting the war for the South Vietnamese. In early 1964, there were just over 10,000 Americans in Vietnam. In 1965, there were nearly 200,000 troops stationed there. Nearly 400,000 by the end of 1966, nearly 500,000 by 1967, and at its peak in 1968, the United States had committed 536,000 troops to fight in Vietnam, over 3 times our current deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. Through most of this escalation, most Americans held steadfast to the Truman Doctrine of containing communism's spread, but there were some very noticeable flaws in our method of sending troops overseas to fight via the draft. On the surface, the selective service seemed fair. Men between the ages of 18 and 26 had to apply for the draft and could only be excused from serving if they had legitimate medical reasons. If, however, one could find a sympathetic doctor, a potential draftee could get a phony medical note disqualifying them from the service. This, however, greatly depended upon one having the money and connections to find such private doctors. Many people sought out deferments, that is, delays, in having to serve. Some joined the National Guard or the Coast Guard, such as former President George W. Bush, which secured a deferment from going overseas. Others went to college to get a deferment, such as former Vice President Dick Cheney, and enrolled in graduate school when they found out the war's length was stretching on. This, however, also required money. Deferments were also granted for men who got married and for children as well, as former Vice President Dick Cheney obtained 2 further deferments in his requirement to serve his country during the Vietnam War. As a result of this easily manipulated draft system, poor Americans overwhelmingly made up the bulk of draftees. African Americans especially found themselves overrepresented in the draft. Blacks made up only 10% of the U.S. population, but 20% of all draftees were African American. The balance of service was so blatantly shifted against blacks that even Martin Luther King Jr. couldn't hold back his bitterness when he commented in 1967, quote, "We have been faced repeatedly with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools." Despite the fact that the armed forces had been desegregated for nearly 2 decades, the racial conflicts that had escalated back home in the mid-1960s in the form of race riots across America's cities spread into the armed forces. This violence was also indicative of a declining morale in U.S. troops. It seemed that as the U.S. threw more and more men against the North Vietnamese, the fight and our objectives became more and more diluted, frustrating, and confusing. For the Vietnam War, there were no 4 freedoms to guide our fight, no clear-cut German or Japanese enemies who would meet us on the field of battle, as the Viet Cong relied more and more upon guerrilla tactics to wage war against a better-armed enemy. Paranoia and fear of what lurked in Vietnam's jungles increased. The youth organized. Student organizations formed across the country with the intent of raising important questions about Vietnam and what our government was telling us about the war. The New Left reincarnated the political energy popular during the 1930s as FDR radically changed the nature of our federal government, demanding sweeping changes in our national government. Students for a Democratic Society, also known as SDS, was established in 1960 and openly attacked the institutions that seemed to be profiting off of the bloodshed in Vietnam, namely weapons manufacturers and the governmental institutions that got so much taxpayer money during times of war. SDS wanted to see America become more participatory in its democracy. It gave a voice to the increasingly frustrated youth who felt completely left out of the decision-making process concerning the fight in Vietnam, as even 18, 19, and 20-year-olds were often not old enough to vote. At the University of California at Berkeley, the free speech movement gained prominence first by challenging the established leadership at the university over its support of the war effort in Vietnam, and then criticized the UC's policy of denying students the opportunity to actually have a hand in directing their own school's political policy. In 1965, SDS claimed more than 20,000 members and drew over 30,000 to a protest rally against the war in Washington, D.C. By the mid-1960s, college campuses became hotbeds for discussion and dissent against the Vietnam War, as many of those students tried to gain the power and voice necessary to put an end to the war before their draft number came up, and potentially put an end to them. By 1967, the point at which troop deployment in Vietnam had nearly peaked, Vietnam protesters had transformed into resistors. Draft dodging became more frequent as more and more youth fled to Canada or Mexico to escape being called to duty. Some protesters publicly burned their draft card and faced prison time at home instead. With the public release of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, which were military documents that analyzed the U.S. history of involvement in Vietnam and projected the probability of various U.S. desired outcomes, public outrage over the war exploded. These papers showed that Lyndon Johnson had planned to escalate the Vietnam War, including regular bombing runs of North Vietnam, well before he was elected in 1964, despite the fact that he campaigned for president that year against escalating and conducting bombing missions in Vietnam. The papers also seem to show that obtaining a victory of the nature that the U.S. wanted, that is, to get rid of the communist forces in Vietnam, was an impossibility, due largely to the style of fighting the Viet Cong engaged in, as well as heavy Chinese and Russian support of the North Vietnamese army, who took over the bulk of the fighting from the Viet Cong after the Tet Offensive in 1968. In essence, the Pentagon Papers showed the government lying to Americans about the nature of, and chances for, victory in Vietnam.